Hello, and welcome to Free Press Live. I'm your host, Vanessa Maria Graber, brought to you by Free Press, a nonprofit, nonpartisan media reform advocacy organization. Free Press Live is your weekly source for updates and live discussion of what's happening in the world of communications rights. You can learn more about our work at freepress.net. On today's show, we're going to talk about the collapse of the communications networks in Puerto Rico following Hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017, which contributed to the historic death toll. Between 3,000 and 5,000 people died after those hurricanes. Since then, Free Press has worked with Puerto Rican allies to hold the Federal Communications Commission and the federal government accountable. On Monday, the Government Accountability Office publicly released a report that criticized the Trump FCC's response to the devastating communications outages in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria. The agency's lack of transparency and its undefined role in disaster response prolonged recovery efforts after Hurricane Maria and hindered Puerto Ricans' access to life-saving communications. Today, we'll talk with Senior Policy Counsel Carmen Scarado and Policy Counsel Leo Fitzpatrick of Free Press to talk about our work to advocate that communications are restored on the island and to assure that local and federal authorities are working to prevent another communications crisis from happening again. But first, a few news headlines. Yesterday marked the 100th anniversary of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. President Biden traveled to Tulsa, Oklahoma, to talk about one of the single greatest acts of racist terrorism in U.S. history. Over the span of 18 hours, a white mob burned down what is known as Black Wall Street, the thriving Black neighborhood of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and killed an estimated 300 African Americans. Those who survived were left without housing, without businesses, and forced to live in internment camps. For more information about the Tulsa Massacre, check out a very insightful episode of Free Press Live featuring Free Press staff Joe Torres, who also authored an in-depth blog about the massacre on our website. A private company on Tuesday took over the transmission and distribution of operations of Puerto Rico's Power Authority, which has struggled with blackouts and bankruptcy, corruption, and mismanagement. The takeover by U.S. company Luma Energy is taking place under a 15-year contract coincided with the beginning of the Atlantic hurricane season, with many across Puerto Rico worried about the transition and whether the new company can handle a severe storm. In Puerto Rico, unions are planning a general strike on Thursday in response to the privatization of the island's power system. Labor leaders are demanding the cancellation of a contract with the private U.S. and Canadian company Luma Energy. Unions have warned that the agreement with Luma will increase the cost of electricity, displace thousands of workers, and allow the company to leave the island if another hurricane hits. FCC Commissioner Brendan Carr says it's time that big tech companies like Amazon, Facebook, and Google, which have reaped huge fortunes from the internet, pay their fair share to help the federal government fund its effort to close the digital divide. In an op-ed published in Newsweek last week, Carr outlined a new approach for funding the FCC's Universal Service Fund, which provides money the federal government uses to help subsidize the build-out of broadband in rural areas, phone and broadband service, and for low-income Americans, and internet service for access to schools and libraries. For more information about the internet and broadband policy, visit our website at freepress.net. Now I'd like to introduce our guests who have been longtime advocates for telecommunications policy in Puerto Rico, are both attorneys working at Free Press. Carmen Scarado is Senior Policy Counsel at Free Press, where she develops legal strategies, policies, and regulatory filings to protect the open internet, promote network resiliency, foster universal broadband access, prevent media consolidation, and ensure platform accountability. She co-leads Free Press's organizing on Puerto Rico telecommunications policy. Leo Fitzpatrick is Policy Counsel at Free Press, working on the Free Press policy team to advocate for affordable and equitable access to high-speed internet services, protect the open internet, and prevent media and telecom concentration. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back, Vanessa, and to discuss one of the most important issues I've probably worked on in my time at Free Press. And as always, a huge fan of the show.
Thank you so much for joining us here. As I mentioned earlier, a really important report was recently released by the Government Accountability Office, which detailed some information about how the FCC and the Department of Homeland Services responded to Hurricane Maria in the past. Almost 4 years ago, Puerto Rico experienced two devastating hurricanes, Irma and Maria, which led to between 3,000 and 5,000 deaths on the island, catastrophic damage, and a historic communications crisis. Tell our listeners more about what happened on the island in regard to telecommunications and the period of time after the hurricanes in which you were advocating for the restoration of communications infrastructure. Carmen, let's start with you. You've been working on this since before your time at Free Press, when you were at National Hispanic Media Coalition.
Yeah, so let's go back in time. You mentioned Hurricane Irma. That happened in September 6th of 2017. And then September 20th of 2017 is when Hurricane Maria hit. So what ended up happening is that Irma did knock out some of the electricity, some of the communications, but then when Maria came in, it really wiped everything out. So there was 100% blackout of electricity on the island, and the FCC reported that a few days after the storm, 96% of the cell sites were out of service. So Puerto Ricans were really left in the dark, and people were not able to reach critical communications like life-saving services. They weren't able to call family to make sure that family members were okay. And I have a lot of family on the island, and that's where I was born. So I was really concerned with what was going on, and I was luckily able to communicate with them. So for whatever cell sites were still in service, every once in a while, my family was able to send a few text messages. And this really concerned me that the FCC didn't seem to be doing much, and they weren't really, they weren't really communicating what they were up to. And this is something that we noticed very early on, especially when they announced the Hurricane Recovery Task Force. They said, we have this task force, we're on it, we're going to be helping Puerto Ricans. And from that moment on, we're saying, well, what are you doing? And we started asking those questions really early on, because we knew that the people needed communications. And one of the things that the report says, which I think is really important to highlight here, is that they said that the loss of communications has cascading detrimental effects on critical infrastructure. So what that means is that if you don't have communications, you can't figure out where to best put, the logistics of everything, right? Like, how do you get your power back up and running? How do you get supplies to where people need it the most? You need communications to do that. And so it was really, really detrimental and really prolonged the recovery efforts that communications was down for so long after the storm. And even like months later, there were like 80% of the cell sites were still out of service. So, it was really a devastating time right after the storm.
Thank you for that overview. And full disclosure, my family also lives in Puerto Rico. And during that time, it took us 9 days to be able to communicate with our family members to find out what was going on with them. And from that point on, as you mentioned, their service was very limited, and they had to travel 20 minutes to the city center in order to get a signal. And so they would send one person from the family to go down there to communicate with everybody else. Another issue that happened throughout a lot of the cities is the mayors were supposed to be equipped with satellite phones, but they were unable to give them those phones because so many of the roads and highways were blocked with debris. And so for many of us in the diaspora who have family on the island of Puerto Rico, there was a long period of fear and uncertainty about whether or not our family members were alive. And finally, it's important for our viewers to understand that the 911 emergency response system also completely collapsed. And that was one of the primary reasons people were not able to call for help to get medical services from paramedics and other emergency personnel. And so those are all the things that we talk about when we say there was a collapse of communications infrastructure. Since you have both been at Free Press, you've led a campaign to advocate for the restoration of this infrastructure and an investigation into the hurricane response. Can you tell us more about that work and some of the steps Free Press has taken to hold government agencies like the FCC accountable and these communications companies who were supposed to work quickly to restore infrastructure? And can you also talk about your groundbreaking report detailing the FCC's failures in regards to communications? Leo, I'll let you chime in and add anything else about some of the work that you've done under that umbrella.
Sure, and I actually just wanted to underscore that, what happened in Puerto Rico was extreme. It was so uniquely, and the communications blackout was so expansive and so long that it really doesn't have too much of a modern equivalent. It might be one of the worst communications blackouts in modern U.S. history. And you didn't have to be, and I think one of the things that immediately rang true for most folks was you didn't have to be a telecom expert to know something was seriously wrong. When we started actually digging into some of the research shortly thereafter, we found there was only, it wasn't just the cell phones were down. It wasn't just that you couldn't get on your phone. You had zero internet pings for the undersea cable for a period. And that actually disrupted all of the internet communications going to South America as well. This was such a thorough obliteration of communications that you only had one AM station. It just happened to survive the initial onslaught, broadcasting any kind of information. So whenever folks have access to those hand cranked emergency radios, you might not have been able to pick up much of anything, and that would have been an important source of information to get alerts out about. There was a lot of flooding, there was a lot of landslides that are extremely dangerous, and the government, whether it was federal or the territorial, wouldn't be able to get the alerts out. And actually, you mentioned the 911 centers. The facilities themselves were actually there were two facilities there, and they were completely physically destroyed, and they couldn't actually safely get people there. And it even got even worse because as our societies become more reliant on mobile communications and high-speed internet access to stay connected, there were fire stations that had difficulty even calling out to see if how their firefighters might be were okay and be able to call them in and direct them to actually be the actual first responders. And some of the first ham radios that were sent to fire stations, and something you didn't have to be an expert to know something was seriously amiss. And sorry if I went a little long, but I definitely wanted to underscore how terrible it was. And I also think it's important to sort of start at the beginning of our advocacy with a brief overview of how we actually came to work on this. It actually began with the great Joseph Torres, who you had on last week discussing the ugly racism and legacy of the Tulsa massacre. He immediately recognized as well that what was happening in after Hurricane Maria was uniquely terrible. And as many folks on the mainland, eagerly awaited any news about their friends, loved ones, and colleagues, and they found almost no information. So he pulled together Puerto Ricans on staff, along with allies, and trained our advocacy, media, and telecom expertise and experience, and trained that on the FCC to ask these sort of hard questions. And as the communications blackout persisted, we kept asking ourselves more and more questions about the FCC's role here. What is it exactly? And that's actually how I came to work with the brilliant Carmen, who was another advocacy organization at the time, and then we continued our work there. And I did want to talk, through all of this, we kept raising these questions. And one of the first things that we did was decide to sort of put all the questions in one place. So this is the report that we authored. And sometimes I hesitate to call it a report. I just describe it as a 30+ page document asking a lot of questions that the government should have been either collecting and providing to the public, but failed to. So, I would say the GAO report notes a lot of what we already knew, but it also serves as sort of a bittersweet vindication about how the FCC didn't engage with affected communities. But I think the one of the most important aspects of this is one of the first things that we worked on together, Carmen, when you were at NHMC, was asking the FCC to give Puerto Ricans more time to actually participate in a room again. I don't know if you want to jump in and talk about that.
Yeah, sure.
Well, there's sort of two themes here, right? There's one around transparency, right? Not knowing what is being done, right, through this hurricane task force. And then the second question is around engagement and inclusion of the Puerto Rican public to be able to fully understand and participate in this process. Carmen, can you talk about those two issues and the concerns that you have in regards to transparency and engagement?
Sure. So in terms of the transparency and engagement part, back in 2018, the FCC said, oh, we're going to put out this public notice, or I think it was at the end of 2017, and we want to learn more about what happened in Puerto Rico. And as Leo mentioned, I was at the National Hispanic Media Coalition at the time, working, in coalition with Free Press. And we said, wait a minute, you're asking for public comment, but a lot of people still don't have access to communications on the island. How are you engaging with Puerto Ricans? How are you, what does that outreach look like? And we filed, we filed what's called a motion for extension of time, just asking them to hold on and to really do that critical outreach so that they can hear from the people that were most impacted after the storm. And the FCC said no, that they were going to move forward with that notice, that they wanted to get to their report, they wanted to do their workshops, and they thought it was really important to get out this information, again, without that critical input from the most impacted communities. And so that was, really concerning. And that's what's highlighted in the GAO report too. It actually does say that the FCC failed to conduct this outreach and engage with Puerto Ricans on the island. And the other piece of it is this transparency piece. And so Leo mentioned, we have this great report that highlights a lot of the questions that we still have about what the FCC's role was after Hurricane Maria hit the island. But one of the things we also did is we filed a Freedom of Information Act request at the commission saying, can you provide us with the documents showing what you have done to help Puerto Rico recover after Hurricane Maria? And one of the sets of documents that we asked for was the meeting minutes, any information regarding this hurricane recovery task force. Like, what is it up to? You made an announcement. This is what the FCC did. They said, we're creating this task force. We learned that it was just FCC officials. So there was no outside engagement. But beyond that, they just said, no, that's not information that we're going to give you. And, that's something that, again, in this GAO report, they highlight and they say, we actually think that it's important for the public to know what the Hurricane Recovery Task Force was up to, because it really provides clarity about the FCC's role and what they were doing to help people. And we don't, again, we just don't know the full extent of what they were doing and what they weren't doing. And without that public input, and again, reaching out to the most impacted people, it's really hard to understand, what can be done better, because I think what we all want here is to look forward and to really address, the FCC's role when the next disaster hits, because we know this, like the climate crisis, we're going to see more hurricanes hit the island, and we want everyone to be prepared.
Yeah, it's really important to involve the people of Puerto Rico in the process, and also to make the information readily available in Spanish, which the FCC did not do at first.
Right.
And then, there's been so much convening around hurricane response. And one of the findings that's universal is that working with groups on the ground in all of the most hard to reach locations was pivotal to people getting access to resources and help. And so, again, for the FCC to work more closely with local community-based organizations in order to do that outreach. If you're just tuning in, I'm Vanessa Maria Graber, and you are listening and watching Free Press Live. It's a program put on by Free Press, media advocacy organization. Today, we are talking about an important report that was recently released by the Government Accountability Office detailing the hurricane response efforts after Hurricanes Maria and Irma in Puerto Rico, and the roles of the Department of Homeland Security, FEMA, and the FCC. And I'm joined by my colleagues at Free Press, Carmen Scarado and Leo Fitzpatrick. And we've been talking about Free Press's role in organizing a campaign to hold those agencies accountable and to better understand what exactly happened that led to a critical, catastrophic communications collapse on the island after those hurricanes. You mentioned just now, we are starting hurricane season. June 1st marks the beginning of hurricane season in the Atlantic. What are your concerns about Puerto Rico and other parts of the United States as we've also experienced historic wildfires, tornadoes, and flooding in regards to communications, emergency communications, and the role that the FCC plays in responding to these communities in the aftermath?
Carmen, did you want to take that? Or, I'm happy to jump in.
Go ahead, Leo.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. I think so there's two things. We're obviously looking forward and also looking back. One of the things about looking back is, we're not even sure if Puerto Rico has recovered to the point it was in terms of telecom and where all of the access to communications was pre-storm. So they're still recovering. The government, the FCC did issue, it was interesting, they actually took money that was already slated and they renamed it, and they did add some additional sum on top of that. But a lot of that money, a bulk of it, isn't going to be handed out until 3 to 10 years down the road. And that money is supposed to accelerate the recovery of these networks. One of the biggest things that the acting chairwoman, Rosenworcel, had pointed out then, and we hope that she might look into in the future, very near future, is how that money is actually being spent. Did it actually do what it was set out to do to accelerate the recovery? So now, we have some promising signs that some providers have actually buried, for instance, their fiber optic cables and whatnot. But a lot of this is sort of what each provider is sort of willing to do. And we haven't really seen the FCC, again, this is reiterated in the GAO report, actually step in and do a little bit more, be a little bit more assertive and a little bit more proactive and sort of charting all of this out. Could a lot of these providers be burying more of their fiber, and that would make it resilient to a lot of the weather events going into the future? And we don't know. So I think there are still like these looming questions. And then looking forward, Carmen actually wrote this great piece about how the climate crisis led to an unexpected cold snap. These were supposed to be once in a century cold snaps, and now they're sort of clockwork 10 years. And a lot of the battery backups and sort of backup systems were not winterized. So we actually saw T-Mobile outage, in particular T-Mobile outages, among others, precisely at a time when Texans actually needed to find out, where can I go? Where are some resources to keep tabs on friends and families? Again, another terrible instance, but a sort of lessons that we could have actually learned and gleaned many years, almost 4 years ago in Puerto Rico. But we keep seeing them repeated. And again, in California with the wildfires, we also saw these unacceptable outages. And one of the underlying things that you've seen is in a lot of states, the carriers have successfully pushed for deregulation. And one of the few bastions where advocates are putting up the good fight like the Utility Reform Network and Greenlining and others in California especially are pushing back. But to see this sort of resistance to even the state government coming in and saying, here are some minimum, very basic minimum things that you should be doing to make sure that people stay connected, during a wildfire, there's a lot of resistance. And largely what we've seen is this permeate not just each state, but at the federal level too. Well, I can go on, but yeah. I think this again highlights how the FCC used to be the agency that would sort of be at the forefront, the expert agency that steps in and figures this stuff out. And instead, what we see is the FCC sort of having no defined role in the most latest sort of Department of Homeland Security guidance about exactly what it should do. And there was actually a point where in Puerto Rico, Google had sent these balloons over to essentially help with cell phone coverage. And FEMA was like, oh, is this going to actually disrupt or cause interference with our systems, which are very important? And it actually took a week for them to figure out, it took a week for the FCC and FEMA to actually sit down to say, there's not going to be interference, you're going to be okay, and this is how this technology works. And, all that should have been hashed out years ago, or very quickly recognize, hey, that this agency does this stuff day in, day out. It should be able to sit down and provide a lot more leadership in instances like that.
So we only have a few minutes left, but what exactly are we calling on the FCC to do? And I think it's important to distinguish for folks who don't know how the FCC works, is that the old FCC was under the Trump administration, under the leadership of Chairman Ajit Pai. And now with the Biden administration, we have a temporary acting chair, Chair Rosenworcel. So there is an opportunity to change policy and to be able to get more information. Now that the report has come out, we've been organizing on this issue. What is Free Press calling on the FCC to do?
Well, so what we want the FCC to do, and this is what we wanted, for a long time, is to actually conduct a thorough investigation into what happened after Hurricane Maria. This is something that the commission did after Hurricane Katrina. So it is something that it has done before. And because, what we've said today, right, is that you don't have to be a telecom expert to understand that something went seriously wrong. And so we think that it's really important to, to look back, figure out what went wrong, and then come with some new regulations so that we can solve this problem and not run into these issues again. So we can ensure that the networks are resilient to this climate crisis that's happening, whether it be a cold snap, whether it be a hurricane or a wildfire, and really move forward. One of the things that, currently is happening is that there's this voluntary framework that the companies can use to figure out how to help people get connected. And what we saw is that wasn't working in Puerto Rico. And even after Hurricane Michael hit Florida, the FCC actually did put out a report saying, this wasn't working. You're not doing what you're supposed to under this voluntary framework. So, one of the things that we've been calling on is maybe this framework needs to be mandatory. We need to have some rules in place so that the carriers know what their expectations are, and so we can create these resilient communications networks.
At the end of the day, this is really about saving lives, because the loss of between 3,000 to 5,000 lives, if not more, was absolutely catastrophic and horrific. And people of Puerto Rico and the diaspora are still feeling that loss. And I recently visited Puerto Rico and interviewed many folks about the hurricane and about the current political situation. And folks said time and time again that they're just really tired of being treated like second-class citizens. And so part of our advocacy is for getting equal treatment under the law, having a fair investigation, and being able to prevent this from ever happening again. I want to thank the two of you for joining us and for all of your advocacy work on Puerto Rico telecommunications policy, and for sharing your knowledge on the show.
Thank you, Vanessa.
All right, well, we could certainly go on and talk more about Puerto Rico telecommunications infrastructure and the FCC, But for now, you'll have to read more on our website at freepress.net. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit that subscribe button so that you can get more notifications for our next show, Wednesdays at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. If you're watching on Facebook, you can also hit like to Free Press and get our notifications for the next episode. Again, we'd love to hear your thoughts. We welcome suggestions, comments, concerns about telecommunications and other media reform, media justice issues. You can contact us at info@freepress.net. All right, thank you so much for listening and watching, and we'll see you next week.